Hello, Haiku. Back here for more Historic Pauper and Explorer Pauper common set review for Wilds of Eldraine. And just as a review, I'm going to be going through these with the view of assessing them further cards' playability and viability in constructed Pauper, which is Explorer and Historic on Arena. So they may have some overlap with cards that are relevant in Paper Pauper, but uh, the power level of Paper Pauper is much higher than Explorer and Historic. So there may be some card choices or card standouts that are more relevant for arena play rather than Paper play. All right, let's get started. Aquatic Alchemist is a 2 mana 1/3 with an adventure. The adventure, a bubble up, just put an instant sorcery on top of your graveyard from your graveyard on top of your library. Not quite good enough. This is too high of a cost to be able to just put it on top of your library. If it put it in hand, I don't think you would see it at common. Generally, they've reserved that effect for putting something, an instant or sorcery from your graveyard into your hand. At a higher rarities, unless it's attached to a ETB of a creature, and that sometimes sees play at common. So unfortunately, this is just a little bit too weak. The front half of just the creature 2 mana 1/3 that gets a bonus when you cast instant sorcery spell is okay, but just not quite good enough as a whole package to see play. Balluna's Gatekeeper is a 6 mana 6/5 that has an adventure ability of basically unsummon, but it's a sorcery speed adventure for 2 mana, and it's only creatures, and it's only creatures you don't control, and they have to have mana value 3 or less. Just I hope I emphasized how many writers there are on this that go against this being a relevant spell. And then a 6 mana 6/5 is just too much. Now with the land cyclers from LTR, we just have so much more cards at 6 mana that are so much more flexible than a pretty measly bounce spell that has too many writers to really make it good. So unfortunately, this one is also a miss for me for constructed Pauper play. Diminisher Witch, excuse me, is a 3 mana 3/2 creature with a bargain effect. When it enters the battlefield, if it was bargained, you create a cursed roll and attach it to an opponent. So this was a surprise to me. I thought cursed rolls were going to be a little bit too complicated for common level rarity, but they've done it. The issue with cursed roll is that it doesn't get rid of the abilities of the creature. And a lot of the creatures in Historic Pauper and Explorer Pauper and just regular Pauper in general are their power is based on their abilities, not really their stat lines. And so this not getting rid of the abilities means the curse roll is not such a good roll, and overall just makes this card not a good card. Freeze in Place is a 2 mana sorcery that taps a creature, puts 3 stun counters on it, and scries 2. Unfortunately, without the draw effect on this card, scry 2 gets close, but it's just not quite good enough. There's some, you could put proliferate stun counters, but this effect is just not quite strong enough to be constructed Pauper playable. Ice Out is a cool card, cool design, but unfortunately not quite playable. Instead of sacrificing artifact, enchantment, or token, there are much better cancel variants that get cheaper. So I think those kind of outweigh this card. Into the Fey Court, unfortunately, so it's a 5 mana sorcery that draws 3 cards. And you also get a bonus of creating a 1/1 fairy that can't block, or can only block creatures with flying. Just too much mana for a draw 3. So in Historic, obviously it's not playable because it's competing with Lorien Revealed, which is just a standout all-star. And then in Explorer, this effect is just too expensive. Explorer is a little bit slower than Historic, but to be trying to cast a 5 mana sorcery that doesn't affect the board is just pipe dreams. You can't play this card. Even in standard Pauper, I don't think this is even viable. All right, another bargain card, Johan's Stopgap, which is a 4 mana sorcery that has bargain. It can cost 2 less, so it's a 2 mana bounce spell. Basically, it returns non-land permanent to its owner hand and draw a card. We've had a lot of these variants of Into the Royal, basically, that can either make them cheaper or changes or is an instant, which is the original Into the Royal, or if you want to go back to repeal and or repulse. Repulse was the original creature bounce and draw. Unfortunately, I don't think you want to go with this effect. The bargain in a card that's more based on tempo is a little bit harder, because it's not free to have artifact, enchantment, or token to sack in your deck. So you had to pay to put one of those permanents into play first to get this to be cheap enough to be a playable card. And even then, it's just a borderline card. So too much work for just a borderline effect it basically makes this card not there. Living Lectern. It's a 2 mana 0/4 that has the ability 1, sacrifice it, draw a card, and create a sorcerer token. This not needing the tap is super nice, but unfortunately it's just a little bit too much. 3 mana to basically cycle itself and create a sorcerer role token it is a little bit too expensive. There's more and more creatures that care about the scry effect of the sorcerer role, but I don't think this is quite there. But there's a lot of LTR cards that do like scrying a lot. So potentially, if we get enough of those effects, or most of those, if we get more of the cards that get bonuses for scrying, then this card gets better and better. But unfortunately, the front half, the stat line, is so miserable that you're always going to be looking to get this effect, and then unfortunately 3 mana for this effect is just not where you want to be. All right, Merfolk Coralsmith is a 3 mana 2/3 that has the pump effect, that the new type of it. I call it the Flowstone pump, where it gets +1, but then it gets -1 on its toughness. So you have a set maximum that you can do it. This card is just not playable in Pauper. Misleading Motes, a 4 mana instant that tucks, or it allows the opponent to choose if they want to put it on top or tuck it. This effect, we've had multiple of these already, and they're just not quite playable. You need to like shave a mana off of it, or give it a different bonus, or put it 2 down or something, so you don't have to deal with the creature so quickly after you get rid of it, for delay it for a little while. The other part of this card that makes it a little bit worse is that it's only creatures, where some of these effects can deal with non-creature permanents, which sometimes is useful. All right, Mocking Sprite is a 3 mana 2/1 flyer that makes your instant sorcery spells cheaper. This is a really good effect. The cards that we have already of this effect is Goblin Electromancer and Goblin Anarchomancer. And we have a couple other ones that are more niche. They're like spells on your opponent's turn get cheaper and stuff like that, or auras get cheaper. But instant sorcery spells is pretty clutch. So where I see this is, since we already have this effect in Historic Pauper in enough redundancy between the Goblin Electromancer and Anarchomancer, I think this effect is more relevant for Explore Pauper. And it allows you to be more consistent with there's two infinite combos in Explorer Pauper, and so this gives another piece to combo off for one of those decks. The other deck doesn't rely on cost reducing, but one of them does. And so So this is a relevant addition to that deck, but then in any other deck that's not a combo focused deck, a 2/1 stat line is just too miserable. Talked about it so many times about how one toughness is just a super liability in this format, and so unless you're comboing with this card, you can't play with this card. So it's a 10 out of 10 for the combo deck, and then a 0 out of, or it's not constructed playable for any other deck. All right, Abria's Attendance, a 5 mana 3/4 flyer with finally we get an instant speed adventure in blue. Unfortunately, this effect is not that good. Just decreasing the power of a creature doesn't mean, usually you can't trade and punish an attack or a block. And so it doesn't quite work out. And then the second half of the card being a 3/4 flyer for 5 is just too miserable to beat C play. Quick Study. Quick Study is very interesting because we have finally outclassed Divination, and now we can draw 2 cards at instant speed for 3 mana. Unfortunately, came a little bit too late. I think the meta has kind of moved beyond this being a good thing. I could see some draw go decks wanting to play this, but draw go is just such a liability now in Pauper, because there's so many non-creature effects in every color that are big issues for control decks. And so before the card pool got so deep, you could be playing Essence Scatter, and Essence Scatter could really answer basically any threat that because they would have to present a creature. But there's enough non-creature threats that it's a little bit of liability to just only rely on counters. And so Quick Study is hurt by that effect because it would slot into that kind of deck. So it's interesting that this is a much better card than anything that we've seen before, but still probably not quite there. It is one to keep an eye on. If we get a more efficient kind of catch-all removal spell that can allow control decks to answer creature and non-creature permanents in a flexible manner, then this may come back into prominence. Okay, next card is Sleight of Hand. It's a 1 mana, it's a reprint, 1 mana sorcery. Look at the top 2 and put one of them in your hand, one at the bottom of your library. So I think this slots between so we only have Opt and Consider on Arena. And so as far as the blue 1 mana cantrips, I think this is right between the two. So the best one I think is Consider, because it's instant speed and it can put the card into your graveyard, which is relevant for a lot of the decks. And then it's probably better than Opt. It depends on the deck too. Obviously, in a draw go style deck, you want the instant speed card filtering. But I think Sleight of Hand, looking at the 2 cards first and then deciding which one to keep and which one to get rid of is slightly better. But only slightly. It's funny, slightly Sleight of Hand. So this may see play in some decks, especially like combo focused decks, to give them another cantrip to kind of assemble their combo, but it's not going to be a big player. It may, again, just see play in those decks, and may even go up to a 4 of in some of those decks, but I doubt it. I think this is more like, copies 5 through 6 of Consider rather than 5 through 8 of Consider. All right. Next card, Snare Master Sprite. So this is a 1 mana 1/1 a flyer, and then it has basically a kicker effect. If you pay 2 when it comes into play, so we're talking about a 3 mana play, you can tap a creature and put a stun counter on it so it doesn't untap. So very strong effect. We kind of already have this effect kind of split into 2 different cards. We have at 1 mana, we have the Network Disruptor, which is the 1 mana 1/1 flyer that can tap a creature but doesn't keep it tapped. And then at 3 mana, we have there's a Bird Wizard 3 mana that it's a 2/2 flyer that has the same effect. It taps the creature and it doesn't untap for the next turn. So obviously, when looking at it, both of those cards are better than this card at each of the respective mana. So the big draw of this card is the flexibility of choosing if you want a 1 mana card or a 3 mana card in your deck. The other big part, which will become clear later, is now we actually have a lot of fairy synergy cards. So it being a fairy creature type is actually pretty relevant, and I think will now change what I was calling the ninja deck in Historic Pauper. I think we'll now call it what they call it in Paper Pauper, which is just fairies. We don't have Spell Stutter Sprite, which is the big fairy tribal payoff, but I'm about to get to it, so I'm going to be talking about the fairy tribal payoff card of Spell Stutter. So obviously a lot worse than Spell Stutter Sprite, but it's still a very strong card. We're already playing with Make Disappear and the other Quench knockoffs that are slightly better than Quench. Make Disappear was basically the casualty part of Make Disappear was kind of a last case scenario, or worst case scenario where you had to counter a creature, something that was coming down, and so sacking one of your valuable creatures that was beating down to counter it was something that you loathed to do, but if you had to, you had to. Where this card, once you have just one fairy in play, it's a mana leak, and then it just gets better from there. So this is going to be a very, very strong card. There's a lot of comparisons to Lofty Denial, which is a 2 mana counter that without any flyers. So it's based on having flyers in play. Without any flyers, it's a force spike. It counters unless they pay 1. But then if you have a flyer, then it counters unless you pay 4. So with just one flyer. If it was one flyer that happens to be a fairy, Spell Stutter is worse than that card. But I think the Spell Stutter is so much more of a stronger card because of the fail case scenario of not having a fairy or a flyer in play. When you can counter something unless they pay 2, it's so much better than if you can counter something unless they pay 1. And so this really, really elevates the fairies deck. And so like I was talking about with this other card, you now are paying attention to tribal types of fairies. And so I think this card, and there's another card that is coming in the black section, really, really elevate the strength of this card. Because it is a fairy that's going to slot into the fairy deck, it gets better. And that was why I kind of was talking about, when I was talking about the equivalent cards at 1 and 3 mana, I made sure to mention their tribes, because none of them are fairy. And so even though this card is worse than those other 2 cards, I think this being a fairy type is very relevant. And then again, the flexibility of this card being your turn 1 play, so then you can ninja on turn 2, and then later on you can take advantage of the kicker, or if you draw it later on in the game, you can kick it. That flexibility really ups the fairy ninja archetype in Historic Pauper. All right, moving on. So from Spell Stutter, we're now moving on to Stormkelp Prowler, which is a 2 mana 2/1. Whenever you cast a spell with 5 mana or greater, put 2 +1/+1 counters on it. Putting 2 +1/+1 counters for doing anything is a pretty big payoff, but unfortunately, this is almost there. 5 mana is the big cutoff, where Lorien Revealed is at 5 mana, so you can have a lot of those and play it. But until you play the 5 mana spell, this is just such a liability, being only 1 toughness to start. If it was a 1/2 or potentially even a 2/2, I don't think they've ever printed a 2/2 in blue with upside. This would have been a much stronger card. As it stands, I don't think it's playable. It's just hurt too much by 1 toughness. All right, moving on to Ventress Transmuter, a 4 mana 3/4, no text. and with an adventure. The adventure part is unfortunately in blue. Again, we have another sorcery, and it's 2 mana. I don't know why they made all the adventures in blue at sorceries at 2 mana. So it's tap a creature and then create a curse roll token attached to it. I talked about how the cursed roll token wasn't really ideal when I went over the white cards. The biggest issue with the cursed roll is that Pauper, the strength of the card is not really in the power and toughness. It's more in the abilities of the card once it's in play. And so the fact that this doesn't get rid of those abilities really holds it back. So unfortunately, that just holds back this whole card, unfortunately. Water Wings is a 2 mana instant that you can give a creature a base power for a base PT 4/4, but then it also gains flying and hexproof. So some people were speculating that this card may be viable in a blue-red Kiln Fiend type deck because you give the Kiln Fiend evasion and the hexproof. But at 2 mana, I think it's a little bit too expensive. So it does a lot, but it's a little bit too expensive. If it didn't up the base power and toughness, or if it was 1 mana less and it had slightly less of a bump in the power and toughness, then it could be a consideration. But as it stands, I don't think this card is good enough for constructed. All right, well, that finishes up the blue. Again, like I said, with the white section, very, very strong set. Unfortunately, blue, the strength of it came in basically in 2 cards that are kind of slot into the same deck. So let me. I mean, this is just like honorable mention, potentially in the future can be, but then the real strength of the blue cards that were spoiled is in Spell Stutter and Snare Master Sprite. Comment down below if you think I missed any, and I'll be moving on to our black cards.